This is the Baunfire Gaming Podcast, episode 345. I am your host, Morgan, aka Bon Diesel, and this week we'll be talking about Game Pass is obviously profitable, Escape from Tarkov's weird moves right before their full launch, Stop Killing Games hits 1 million signatures, and much more. I have been doing this stuff for a long time. I started doing content creation, I want to say in like late 2016, early 2017. It started off with literally making my first Twitter account, by the way, and posting builds and screenshots of the Division 1. This was in, I want to say, like spring, summertime of 2016. I started doing that. I wanted to get involved in the community. I had been involved in Reddit for a long time. The Division subreddit was kind of a hot mess, and I wanted to try to find something else. And at the time, I was silly enough to think that the Twitter community would be less of a hot mess, and that had its ups and downs. But I've been doing this a long time. I went from posting screenshots and build pictures of the builds I like to use in that game to getting involved in Twitch as a viewer, watching various streamers, specifically the Division's developer, Ubisoft Massive and Red Storm, had like a weekly community stream they would do. So I used to watch that and comment in there and started getting to know people. And they even did a gameplay stream fairly often as well. I would jump into that and, even sometimes play with the devs. And that was a lot of fun. Then I moved on to my own Twitch to starting this podcast, which used to be the Division podcast. And it's all kind of gone from there. Now I have this podcast, the Mass Effect one. I do, believe it or not, stream on Twitch still occasionally. I'm still very active on social media, on basically all of them. And it's been interesting seeing the evolution. This week, I saw an article about how Asmongold is the largest gaming streamer currently and ever. Ever is kind of a weird measure. It's kind of how like every time a game console comes out, they're always like, it's the most of this console or the most console ever sold. Well, it's like, yeah, the games industry in general is growing pretty quickly. And so, yes, a product that releases today has a really good chance of selling more than one released 5-10 years ago. But that's a whole different thing. And it relates to the whole thing with the biggest creators now are obviously bigger than ones years ago. But Asmongold is a unique situation because I don't even care to get into the political side of things with him, really. He's obviously way out of his depth in basically everything he does. Asmongold is a really interesting guy because he's not particularly smart. He's not, at least in my opinion, he's not charismatic or interesting or well-spoken or funny. He's just a guy who started doing some stuff with good timing, and probably had a lot of luck. And when you look at a lot of big streamers, sometimes there are people who are just genuinely the most charismatic people ever. If they weren't content creators, they would be some other kind of personality in some industry, right? And then you look at other people. I think Asmongold's a pretty good example of someone, if he wasn't the biggest Twitch streamer in the world or online game streamer or whatever you consider him, he would at best be just like a regular person who works 40 hours a week at a job he doesn't really love, or he would, especially with some of his what appear to be some mental health issues and lack of being able to care for himself like a normal person, would potentially be in a bad situation, or one worse. His current situation doesn't seem amazing, but he's a multi-millionaire, so I'm sure that helps. But seeing someone like him become this, to have this label, the biggest game streamer or whatever, is weird, and it's concerning, and it's depressing in a way, and it's not surprising at all. I think the whole rise of in the influencer content creation side of things, of these people who are extremely toxic, not really all that smart, very clickbaity, sensational. Um, this started a long time ago, and maybe even before I know this, but I noticed it back in the Division days. There was a guy named Sank back then, and a few other people who I will remain nameless because they're like Voldemort. If you say their name, you fear that they'll appear again, and I don't want that smoke at this point in my life. But these people, Sank was the founder of Upper Echelon Gamers. I think he still makes content. And predictably, he's the last thing I saw from him is that he's one of these hyper right wing, hyper toxic, hyper anti woke, or whatever they're calling themselves now. People now, and that's fashionable now. It's like the best way to become popular, it seems. But there were people doing this very same stuff, back when I started making content, and likely before, right? Now, back then, I think it was a little more taboo. I think people had less patience for it back then. I think it was like more annoying back then, basically. And it was just less acceptable, right? Unfortunately, it kind of seems like that isn't the case anymore. And it's become the meta, if anything. But I think sometimes people don't realize that this was brewing for a long time. Obviously, we had like the Gamergate stuff a few years ago, and to the point where in the last year, you even saw the movement by people like Asmongold and Grums and a bunch of these losers, as Gamergate 2.0. I don't think it ever quite met the same veracity, but it was just as awful. And I guess like my whole point of talking about this is that I worry this isn't gonna change, at least not anytime soon. As a content creator who never really made it, even to this day, I basically just do this stuff for fun because I'm not seeing huge amounts of growth, or my numbers are, for me, perfectly fine. But for anyone getting into this now, if they haven't been doing this forever, it would maybe not seem worth it to them. That's fine with me. But it also comes with the caveat of me knowing I could do like 5 things that I bet I would multiply my reach and my engagement and my views and everything at least double, triple, quadruple, if not much more, if I did all of this stuff these people do, right? All of these things that where you essentially sell your morality to become a person in this kind of grifting industry of hypersensitivity to anything that doesn't agree with your personal morals. Honestly, even your personal morals likely being in question. And do I really believe that all of these people truly, really deep in their heart, feel the things they say? Are they truly outraged by these things they pretend to be outraged by? I truly don't believe they are. I think they have found their niche and they are exploiting it for everything they can, and they're unfortunately making generational money doing it. And that's that I think there's a lot of factors too, like why are people even drawn to these people? I think there's a lot of people who are lonely and sad and unhappy with their lives, and they see someone like this who kind of looks like them, who just happens to also have millions of dollars in their bank account, but talks like them and kind of looks like them, and seems kind of equally sad and depressed as they are, despite having all that money, and you just kind of get indoctrinated into this awful world. What I would say is the best thing you can do if this stuff also annoys you is obviously don't partake in these people's content. Don't watch their streams, don't watch their videos, don't really even engage with things about them or with them directly on social media and stuff. Just ignore them. Because for them, even bad interactions are good, unfortunately. Find people who aren't doing those things. Find people who seem to be trying to be at least positive in some capacity, who seem to be expressing things that they truly do believe, and support people who are doing that stuff, especially small people. Obviously, this sounds like I'm basically saying support me. I'm not really even saying that, support someone. If it's me, great. I love it. Keep watching my videos and my podcast and interacting. And if you want to buy merch or get a YouTube membership or a Twitch subscription, whatever, however you want to support, a view or a comment to me is just as valuable as a subscription or something. Like, yeah, I'll take the couple bucks, but one way or the other, I just am, happy to get people's time because I know how valuable that is. So support good people, ignore the bad ones. Let's try to fix this. I'm not going to say I'm hopeful, but I would love to be surprised. Okay, let's move into some gaming news. We're going to kick it off with a Game Pass discussion that has been hilariously stupid over the last week and has come to the very predictable conclusion. So the topic of Game Pass has been, crazy basically ever since they released it. Talk about profitability and sustainability and a handful of devs coming out and saying that it's bad for the industry, while it seems like the vast majority either have no comment on it or think it's good for the industry. Obviously that comes down to personal preference, but that's kind of a different topic. In the last week, Christopher Dring, who I think was formerly with VGC and is now one of the many, seems like hundreds, at least dozens of former games journalists who think that people care enough about what they think to support them and support their entire livelihood through Patreon, with mediocre podcasts and dishonest articles being written. Excuse my bias. Chris Dring put out a tweet and I believe maybe a post on his own stuff, I have no idea, basically saying, someone told me, a source told me, of course, being very vague, that Game Pass isn't profitable if they count, I think it was development cost of first party games. This sets off a firestorm of people claiming that, once again, Game Pass isn't profitable. Game Pass isn't sustainable. It's bad for gaming. It's bad for developers. It's bad for Xbox. It's bad for Xbox players. Every article you could imagine from every major outlet, and I'm sure minor outlet as well, every gaming influencer on social media, every content creator on YouTube and Twitch and every platform, ran with this, and especially obviously the expected people, right? The people who the console warriors and kind of what I was talking about before with the anti-woke, like all those people, just as bad and often the same people are the hyper console warriors who spend literally their entire day posting about how much they hate the other team's plastic box, right? Like I said, these people tend to be in similar groups as the people I was talking about in the little preamble, but that's a different conversation, I guess. And so this one tweet and whatever else he put out from Chris Dring, really set off this firestorm of, and it's something you see happen all the time. It was unsourced. You're trusting this guy who, in my experience, or from what I've noticed, seems to be very convenient with the truth. Especially, he especially seems to have an issue with Xbox, and that led to a few days later him recanting this claim, claiming that he had spoken to some people who in fact notified him that Game Pass is profitable, even if you count first party game development costs and all that. So that of course set off another discussion of, one, a bunch of people crapping on him, as they absolutely should, for doing what he did, because he put out that first statement, not because he probably knew it wasn't true, but he probably had enough sourcing that he could at least like throw his hands up and be like, what, I'm just saying what I'm being told, guys. But he knew that would catch a lot of traction and get a lot of attention. And, for someone who's trying to make a living now on his own with this kind of what I would call the Patreon grift that you see so many of these creators and journalists and influencers go to when, I assume their regular jobs aren't paying the bills. He knew that putting that out there, that's out there forever, right? There's hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, who saw that, and they will never see his recanting or the coverage of his recanting of this, who now forever are just gonna be like, yeah, Game Pass does suck. and he obviously did this in the fallout of Microsoft doing their layoffs. He's the same type of person who, I don't think he did it himself, but the same people who were pushing the fact that Xbox fired 9,000 people when that wasn't true. The true number is around 1,000, which still sucks, but it's a big difference, right? 9,000 would be almost half of Xbox, where 1,000 was, obviously a much smaller percentage. And to the point where that got pushed so hard, a game developer who's been in the industry for like multiple decades posted that he couldn't believe Microsoft fired 9,000 people. Like, he's one of the most senior individuals I've ever interacted with in gaming, and even that got to him, right? So anyways, Dring recants his statement, saying that he's been told that it is profitable. That sets off, like I said, this conversation about, a bunch of people still trying to like kind of, still hold their hate for it or their animosity towards Game Pass by saying things like, well, what about marketing and stuff? Things that, who knows, right? And then, like I said, also people kind of crapping on them. At least with Dring, he's been pretty blatant and at least in my opinion, pretty blunt about his bias against Xbox. Like, he obviously sees Xbox as whether he likes it or not, I have no idea, but he obviously uses Xbox as like a foil. Is like, I can write any negative tweet or article or make a video, whatever, or do a podcast, whatever, and say bad things about Xbox, and it's going to get good attention. Whether it's true, who cares? He obviously doesn't care too much about that. Good for him, I guess. But what's frustrating is that while he got called out and really showed his ass in this moment, even though it's not going to change anything, he's still going to be, respected by too many people, in my opinion. He's not the only one, and there's plenty of journalists. Jordan Midler is a big one, who also hilariously is at VGC. I think Andy Robinson as well. I think you start to see a pattern here of people who just very clearly, whether or not they have personal animosity for the Xbox brand, I have no idea. I can't read their brains. But if you see their reporting, if you see them on podcasts and on videos and stuff like that, they're not really hiding it, right? They or at the very least, you don't see them talk about other platforms the way they do Xbox, even when those other platforms are doing, equally bad or even worse things in the industry. I think that's kind of expected. I've talked about this before, where from a purely human standpoint, I can appreciate that in the past, especially PS4, PS3 era, that PlayStation just put out a bunch of really great games and people really love those games. And that wasn't a particularly great era, especially PS4, Xbox One for Xbox. And so, people had good feels for Sony, right? And now those people are in their 20s and 30s and even 40s, and they have those biases, which are totally fair. Everyone has a bias, right? But then I think there's also been this trend in the last 3, 4, 5 years of, these websites, these gaming news outlets are not doing great. It's not a great industry. It's not a very profitable industry. We see all these websites shutting down left and right, these podcasts and other outlets, falling apart because they can't get clicks and they can't get ads and they can't do this and that. And it seems like they've all basically resorted to, clickbait, rumors, sensational articles, all this. And, for deserved or not, I think that's a subjective opinion. Xbox has become a pretty good target for these people, it seems like, and for better or worse. I expect content creators and like big influencers and stuff to be kind of weird bias fanboys to a point, like, because no one's looking for integrity from them, right? But what sucks is that gaming journalism now, I think it's arguable that there's no true games journalist out there, that there's no one out there who is truly trying to report on things in the interest of reporting on the truth, right? It seems like now every single one, whether it's the more experienced folks or not, are basically just, content creators with Notepad on their computer, right? And either a large or a not so large audience, whether they are doing their own thing like Chris Dring, or whether they work for an IGN or a Kotaku or a VGC or whatever outlet. And I think that really blows, because it means that we're not getting basically any quality reporting on gaming at this point, because there's no money in quality reporting. All the money is in, borderline toxic and dishonest, sensational, clickbaity articles, or maybe it is real news that's being reported, but it's being reported in the most dishonest way because that's the only way to make it worthwhile from a money perspective. And then the line gets really blurry with like these really, really big content creators. You've got people like Skill Up and others who have like a gigantic reach, a larger reach than many of these game news outlets, but also have a very clear bias, and I would argue a borderline hate or disdain for certain brands and platforms and things like that. They don't really seem to hide it. They don't even try. And my thing, what I will say is that I don't even like, there's absolutely things to hate on Xbox for, PlayStation 4, Nintendo 4, Ubisoft 4, blah, blah, insert whatever gaming corporation here. My issue isn't that there's people who are negative towards those or critical towards those. My issue is with people who have no balance or very little balance in, the kind of content they put out. The people who only put out sensational, toxic, negative stuff, and or the people who completely ignore, who really ignore brands they like and really focus on brands that they don't like, whether it is just strategically, like I've been talking about, or because of a personal bias. And at the very, like if you're going to hate on everybody and also try to love a little, I guess. And it's so hard at this point. There's been so many podcasts and so many influencers and content creators and streamers and journalists who, I felt like we're doing a better job of this, 4 or 5 plus years ago, and who have like completely fallen off the wagon and the chasing engagement and chasing clicks and chasing ad revenue and chasing, industry clout and things like that. And I don't know, I think that sucks. And I think all of that has led to this moment where this fairly notable person in the industry just straight up lied and is now, trying to be like, oh, my bad, I was wrong, which like, I appreciate that. But you do that in the, in the aftermath and after the devastation. Now, and in knowing that the initial statement always gets more attention than the recantment, right? Hilariously, I believe he put out this recantment either the same day or close to the most recent Circana report, which is a big industry analysis on sales and things like that. And it suggested that Game Pass likely grew 30% in June, kind of hilariously. I have to imagine that was boosted by, some games coming to it last month or coming soon, as well as the Xbox game showcase where they showed off a bunch of games that either soon or already or, in the future are coming to Game Pass. And that probably got people going and getting it on all the platforms you can get it on. There was also a kind of an interesting note, kind of a side note here, that a LinkedIn profile from a laid off employee suggests that Game Pass deals can range from $50,000 to over $50 million. This is ranging from, I assume, indie games all the way up to full AAA games from big giant publishers and studios. This shouldn't be surprising. Some deals are for games that have been out for a long time, and they're basically just a, hey, we'll spot you this much money, and you can put, we'll put your game on the service. And I think that there's like bonus deals where like if you hit so many downloads or so many players, you get more money and things like that. To the 50 million, like that's where, you're paying for a big chunk of a game's development with a deal like that. So the deal like that, you're looking at a third party game, a AAA game likely, that is, day one on Game Pass, maybe even as exclusive to Xbox, or, for a time, for 6 months or however long. And that's obviously a bigger deal. I think at the end of the day, the whole conversation around Game Pass is so silly because, it would suck, but if Game Pass was a drain on Xbox and Microsoft, they could just turn it off. They would just, very likely, they would just refund people or give some kind of credit to the people who had like months, if not years, of Game Pass saved up. They would likely give people discounts on the many of the games for a limited time. So if you wanted to keep some of that library, you could just buy them for a discount. My honest opinion is that I don't think Xbox Game Pass will ever disappear. I could very well see at some point, if it doesn't make sense for them, it would just be reduced to a service more like PS Plus, where you would get older games and you know, indie games and stuff like that as part of Game Pass, and you would get first party games maybe like eventually in the long run, and you would get like other perks and stuff like that. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And if they needed to do that, they would just do it. I think that there's this weird assumption that Xbox is like, they have to keep Game Pass forever. Like, they don't. They could just turn it off, right? It would not be a great look for them. It would upset a lot of people, I think, including myself. But they could just do it. Like, if the numbers told them it didn't make sense, they could just get rid of it. And I feel like that point gets lost on people a bit. So, like I said in the opening, you know, mind who you're taking seriously, you know, try not to fall for the bait, and you know, check their sources too. Subnautica 2's publisher Krafton replaced the Striking Distance's founders right before they and others at the studio were expecting a multi-million-dollar bonus. I believe the number was $250 million to be spread amongst the people at the studio. So this has been pretty shady. This came along with news that the game has been delayed to 2026. And from what I can tell, there's already talk about, you know, these former the founders of Striking Distance who make the Subnautica series, and were, you know, they were acquired by Krafton, who is the PUBG you know, publisher, a year or 2 years ago, and it was all hunky dory. It was all, you know, good vibes. And now they've removed all the Krafton has removed the founders, replaced them with their own people, and now the game is delayed, and it doesn't look great. That's not a great situation to be in for Krafton or Striking Distance. It looks real gross, especially because it looks like the move may have been motivated by this. I assume it was part of the acquisition deal, that there would be, you know, if they hit certain milestones with this game, or as a studio, that the people at Striking Distance would have this big giant bonus spread throughout the team. And now that's not happening as far as we know. So I think this is especially notable because Krafton has been getting tons of praise over the last couple months because they acquired Tango Gameworks and the Hi-Fi Rush IP from Xbox. After that studio was shut down by Xbox last year, despite, you know, people loving Hi-Fi Rush, even though they didn't buy it. And then, you know, the big hero story was Krafton buying up the studio and the IP, and saying that they're going to make Hi-Fi Rush 2, I believe. This should throw a lot of water on that excitement, because Subnautica and Striking Distance is a proven commodity. Subnautica was a huge hit, and the Subnautica 2, I've seen tons of people hyped about it, just in my own kind of you know, personal outlook. And this looks real bad. And if I was this studio that got bought up by them, who hasn't made anything yet and is likely years away from putting anything out, I'm just saying, I always felt like that story was a little overly cheered for, because I wasn't under the impression that Krafton is really the best steward on earth, and that they were mostly focused on like PUBG and mobile games and things like that. This move, I think, kind of reinforces that concern. And I just, if I were people at Tango, I wouldn't feel super secure. My take on it was always, you know, the reporting is that Tango was in trouble before Bethesda and ZeniMax were even acquired by Xbox, that they were likely going to be shut down anyways. And then Xbox got them, let them finish Hi-Fi Rush, which was the project they were working on. And it just still didn't make sense. Hi-Fi Rush didn't sell very well, despite being critically praised pretty highly. And they, you know, they cut and run. I mean, you know, and the thing is, at the end of the day, if a company like Xbox can't make it work and doesn't feel like they can do it, I just don't know what people think that Krafton brings to the table that Xbox couldn't. I'm not going to praise Xbox for shutting down that studio. I'm not going to say it was justified, and I feel bad for the people who lost their jobs and stuff. But, like, you know, what does Krafton have that Xbox doesn't? And, you know, what makes people think that they can do what Xbox couldn't? And then you see a move like this, and I feel like Like, I feel like this is dirtier than anything we've ever seen Xbox do. Obviously, layoffs are gross and studio shutdowns are gross, but avoiding this big bonus by firing the founders of the studio you acquired kind of suddenly, I don't know. That's dirty business, in my opinion. Escape from Tarkov has made a bunch of really weird moves with their game in this big update that seems like it's only a few months away from the game actually releasing. If you didn't know, the Escape from Tarkov extraction shooter game has been in a beta or alpha testing for almost 10 years. I believe it's 9 years at this point. And it's still a beta game, despite the fact that they've, in my opinion, basically treated it like a release game. There's, I believe, some financial incentives for them to keep it in beta, but they claim that they're moving it to 1.0 to full release, probably at the end of 2025. A big thing with Escape from Tarkov is they do these things called wipes. Sometimes they're 6 months apart, sometimes they're more, but it's where they reset the game. You lose all your progress, all your gear, you lose everything. They normally add new maps or update maps and change mechanics and add guns and gear and all the, updates to AI and all this crap. And then so a wipe is essentially a reset of the game with a big patch. And in the most recent wipe they just did in the last week, they essentially turned it into a hardcore game. So Tarkov, in my opinion, has actually been made much more casual over the last 3-4 years. And what happens is that there's a bunch of streamers and content creators who literally will play Tarkov for like 10-12 hours a day. And because they get bored in between these wipes, a few of them were doing this thing called a hardcore challenge, where you essentially self-inflicted a bunch of rules that you could only buy equipment from certain things or get it in certain ways, and you couldn't use some mechanics in the game that other people can, and blah blah blah. Well, essentially what happened is the developers of Tarkov have implemented a bunch of these things into this wipe as like just part of the game. So it's interesting to me. Some of the patches, they've already patched out some of these changes, which has made a lot of people happy. Things like there were no quests in the game when they first wiped, which is like the main thing that you do in this game. They've made it so you have like a pouch that even if you die, you don't lose stuff in it. You used to be able to put almost anything in there. Now it's only very certain items that can go in there. So it makes, if you die, it makes it truly devastating. If you have a bunch of money or gear on you, you can't even keep stuff that's like hard to get, especially in early game. And they made it so that the vendors, like the stores that you can buy equipment from, are super expensive now, and you don't make as much money and all this stuff. In some capacity, they're essentially trying to go back to their roots a little bit to make the game a little bit more what the vision seems to have been like 6 or 7 years ago. But then they wanted the game to be big and popular, so they made it more casual, and I think most of the changes were good in that way. So to me, it's just strange to do this last minute, like, actually, we're going to make most of the people we've been targeting for the last 4 or 5 years hate this right before this big version 1 release, right before the game leaves beta. Just seems odd to me. I think one of the issues with Tarkov is that it's gotten a lot of coverage in the last couple of years, especially because so many other teams have tried to do the extraction shooter thing. And especially in recent conversations about Marathon and Arc Raiders and stuff like that, they've kind of presented EFT, Escape from Tarkov, as this like pinnacle of extraction shooters, when really, Escape from Tarkov is not a very good game. It's a very janky game. And it's badly balanced, and it's very buggy, and it's on a bad engine, at least in my opinion. And the studio, Battlestate Games, is run by like someone who's extremely shady. It's run out of Russia. It's run out of St. Petersburg. The founder of the studio has possible ties to like the Russian military and the Wagner group. There's a bunch of really weird stuff they've done with money over the years, where it looks like he may have hoarded like 90% of their money. And that, the people who work there might not really get paid very well, and it might be kind of a bad working environment. And that all gets ignored because a lot of the journalists and content creators who were covering like Marathon and Arc Raiders just don't know anything about Escape from Tarkov. All they know is that it's been fairly successful. It kind of founded the extraction shooter thing, even though there were games before it. But yeah, in the coverage of Marathon and Arc Raiders over the last 6 months, it's just every time I see whether it's Kind of Funny or any of these various other influencers and content creators being like, yeah, they're all chasing that Escape from Tarkov, whatever. It's like, well, they'll never do that because Tarkov is this like decade long process of building a community and stuff like that. And Tarkov also is kind of a bad game. Like, it's not a very good game. It does some things that no other games do. It has some really great gunplay. It has moments where it's the only game that can do some of the things it does. But I still think it's just, I think a lot of people who talk about Tarkov don't actually know Tarkov. And that's become pretty obvious. And I think it's not great for the conversation. I will give Kind of Funny credit that a couple of their people on their team did play Tarkov for it was a couple weeks, I think, on stream. They were getting some of the worst advice, and they really needed like one of like the Tarkov vets to kind of come in and guide them a little bit more. But I appreciate that they at least kind of tried to get into it and see what it was all really about. It's just such a hard game. Like, in my opinion, Tarkov is a game that you kind of have to learn it for like a year or two, and then you kind of figure out how it goes, and then you kind of decide whether or not you're a Tarkov fan or not. So I'm curious to how they play this out for the kind of 1.0 release. I'm assuming they're gonna have like a casual character and then have this hardcore mode, which it seems like they're testing right now. And then they also have a PvE mode. I don't know. They you never know what they're gonna do. They always delay everything they do. The studio head will change his mind at any given moment, and he is especially influenced by the big content creators who are related to the game, like Pestilli and others. So we'll see what happens. I am definitely very curious. The Stop Killing Games movement has gotten 1 million signatures in its EU sign up. The big deal about that is that it gets them recognition by the European Union. They basically have to bring it up in some capacity, and it means that they could pass some new laws or rules that would force any publishers in their region to follow these rules to make sure games can be played after the studios or the publishers stop supporting them. And most of the time when they do that, they basically do it everywhere. It's just cheaper just to have one development kind of path. Now, in this case, that may not be true. And there's even been thoughts of some publishers may skip Europe. I find that pretty hard to believe. It's a gigantic market, especially for PlayStation, and I don't think that'll happen. So one of the interesting things that means this may be getting some movement is that a bunch of gaming lobbyists in the EU have rallied against this movement, basically saying it puts like an undue burden on publishers. And the truth is, it may not even lead to anything that big. I think honestly the most pressure that can be put is from gamers on publishers to make it clear. The thing about this whole thing is because like some of the logic is kind of flawed, right? Like some of the ideas around this aren't really realistic, at least not with games that are already out. And even moving forward, I think the best way to handle this would be for games to have multiple options, right? So a publisher or studio, they could have like an expiration date where when they are, in the terms of the game, when you purchase the game, they make it very clear that they will definitely support the game for at least 2 years, and even then they can probably have an out. But they can say, we guarantee we'll keep the servers up for 2 years. And then after that, we can't guarantee it. And then if the consumer goes in knowing that, it kind of covers their butt. They could also, make a statement, or even, they could also do a thing where they, do a final patch that allows the game to function as much as it can without servers, to have some experience. Anthem was a good example of this. So, which actually, the same day that the petition got 1 million signatures, EA announced that Anthem servers would shut down in early 2026. And Mark Dara, a former BioWare employee, did a whole video about this and talked about how there's so many layers of infrastructure in Anthem's design that use different banks of servers that it probably isn't really possible to actually make the game function without essentially remaking a big chunk of the game. So that he said that basically the offline portions of the game are like the intro, and that maybe you could keep that accessible, that maybe you could do like peer-to-peer stuff. He said that the consoles that this was released on, so the last generation, likely couldn't handle all of the stuff that the game needs, but it's very likely like modern consoles actually could run all of the back-end systems on its own for single player. But the multiplayer, it just likely isn't going to work. And that, it's also worth keeping in mind that this petition is for future games. It's to make publishers and studios in the future clarify how long a game will be supported, and to potentially give options for people to be able to play the game after it isn't supported anymore. And the Anthem example is a good one. The kind of weird part about this has been that a large part of this movement has kind of turned into just being like weaponized and just turning into kind of like a brigading crew. Pirate, what's his name? Pirate Software is a former Blizzard developer. His dad is really well known in the gaming sphere back in the day. If you've ever seen the South Park episode with the World of Warcraft nerd, the big fat guy who's like leaned back in his chair, that's his dad. That's modeled after his dad. He's become a pretty controversial topic amongst, in general, but especially in this, stop killing games movement, as he pretty much came out against it. He's an indie dev now. He has his own video game he works on. He's also part of some other publishing things and stuff like that. And I don't love him. I find him to be very pretentious and a big know-it-all, and kind of like a nice jerk, I guess. That said, I also think that this whole thing has really turned him into this like pariah that he probably isn't really, and has kind of artificially turned into this kind of it's just been weird. It's weird vibes, and it kind of makes the whole movement seem a little less serious, at least to me, because it just feels so artificial. Like it seems like a lot of these people are kind of losing the plot a little bit and not realizing, like not remembering what they're actually here fighting for, and kind of using this original intent, which is good, to try to make games accessible forever for game preservation, things like that. And seems like a large chunk of those people have turned this into just like, brigading and hating this one guy because he doesn't agree with them. He's pretty notable. He has a lot of influence, for better or worse. It just feels yucky in my opinion. But long story short, I'm really curious to see what happens with this. I kind of don't know if anything ever will, but we'll have to wait and see. Some really good news. SAG-AFTRA, the union that most of the voice actors for video games are part of, has ended their strike, and they have signed a deal with all the major publishers and players in the games industry. This is a big deal because, for example, Dragon Age: The Veilguard, we recently got a story from Jason Schreier about how Dragon Age: The Veilguard, the Mass Effect team came in and kind of redid a bunch of stuff in the game in the later parts of development. One thing they weren't able to change though was to record new voice lines and stuff, because they wanted to change the story and the tone of the story, but they weren't able to in a large part because of this strike. It was towards the beginning of the strike, so they couldn't have voice actors come back in and redo lines, so they had to just kind of recycle what they already had, and that probably wasn't ideal. This is cool. This is exciting. If you are, I'm sure there's a bunch of studios right now and publishers as well who are breathing a sigh of relief, because now they can get all these voice actors back in to start working on these games again, because there's a pretty good chance that games that have been in development the last couple of years while this has gone on, or the last year and a half or so, have probably just been sitting on these projects or doing everything they can do other than the voice capture, so that they can have, finally finish their game. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if we see kind of a rush of games in the next 6 months come out, especially before, in the next like 7 or 8 months, before Grand Theft Auto comes out. So that's good news. I'm happy that, and that does mean that they must have gotten some compromise on the AI voice stuff that they were most worried about, which I think was a very fair concern. Multiple studios are bidding to do a Banjo-Kazooie game. This is kind of the short part of the end of the news here. It appears that Toys for Bob, a former Activision Blizzard King studio who went independent but is still working with Xbox, it seems like Toys for Bob is in the running, and Moon Studios, who I believe did the Ori games. That's interesting because that studio is pretty maligned, and that the ownership or the head of the studio is supposedly awful. Allegedly awful and very hard to work for, and presents a really awful dynamic in the studio. So it's kind of interesting that Xbox is even willing to work with them potentially. We'll have to wait and see. Cyberpunk Edge Runners is getting the season 2, the Netflix animated series. It's the same animation studio. It's going to be a new story. I anticipate the Cyberpunk 2077 will probably get some updates to add, weapons and some kind of nods to the characters in this new season, assuming it takes place before 2077. I think there's a chance that it could take place after the events of 2077. They could very well establish some kind of lore, some canon, and it may be kind of a hint towards where the next game is going, which I am predicting, and I've seen a lot of other people predict, it may not take place in Night City again. We may see it take place in Chicago or a future version of a more known city today. So I'm super pumped for Edge Runners season 2. The first one, I would argue Edge Runners has a better story and characters than the actual game itself. And the music was just insanely good. Really great story. I need to watch it again sometime, but yeah, excited for that. Can't wait to see what they do with it. Ubisoft Red Storm has laid off around 20 employees. They were not part of that Tencent deal earlier this year, where a few studios and projects got put under this new, basically, studio inside of a studio, or publisher inside of a publisher, in partnership with Tencent. Unfortunately, Red Storm was not one of the studios who got to be a part of that. If you don't know, Red Storm is a studio that was founded by Tom Clancy to make Tom Clancy games. So the early Rainbow Six games, Ghost Recon games, some of those early games were, under them. They got bought out by Ubisoft, and then came Splinter Cell, I think, and The Division, and a bunch of other games that have come out. Rainbow Six Siege, Rainbow Six Vegas, all those games. Were all done by Red Storm until fairly recently. Around 2016, they started helping out with The Division, and they started doing some VR games as well. And the Ghost Recon franchise was given to Ubisoft Paris, who I think ruined it personally, but that's a hot take from me. And so this sucks because Red Storm was working on The Division Heartland. It was going to be their own. They were leading it, and that got canceled. And then they were co-deving X Defiant, but we also know that is currently shuttered as well, and it was a big disaster. So I don't know what they're doing. My assumption is they're going to co-dev on The Division 3, which we assume is in production or will be soon. And that might be what they're relegated to, and that sucks. It especially sucks because the 4 or 5 kind of head people there who I knew, Terry Spear and some others, like I don't think any of them are still there. So since The Division 2, they've lost most of the people, at least I was aware of, and that's a bummer. So good vibes to the people at Red Storm. It's probably not a great feeling there right now. Stalker 2 has been announced for PlayStation 5 later in 2025. This was a game that came out on Game Pass day 1 and was on PC as well. Obviously, they're saying it's going to have some the expected upgrades for PS5 Pro and the DualSense controller, all that. It's also supposed to have just general enhancements and updates and content for all the platforms it's on. This game was so strange because it was a complete mess when it came out, and I believe they've patched it and updated it quite a bit, made it a lot better. And even though like you had to restart the game like every hour, or else it would bog down and the FPS would drop to nothing, and it would quit. Even with that, I played 30 plus hours of it, and it was one of my favorite games last year. The story, the world, the combat, like it's a really fun game. And I'm really excited to potentially play another playthrough with the like fixed version of the game that isn't quite as a hot mess as it was when it came out. I still managed to enjoy it a ton, and I'm glad to see that it's coming to another platform. That's always good for a third-party studio like that. And I hope it gets more of its flowers. And then finally, I have upgraded my phone finally from a Pixel 6a to a 9a, the newest model. I am super pumped. It is quite exciting to have something that 6A's, you with your old phones, they always feel fine until you play with a new one. And I recently played with like a Galaxy S25 or something, and it made me realize just how much of a dog my old 6A was. So I'm enjoying the upgrade. Maybe I'll do a more formal review next week or something, but so far I'm pretty impressed by it. I did hate I got a Spigen, like kind of like an armor case, and it's way too thick. I don't like it. So I have a much lower profile one coming soon. And yeah, maybe I'll do a little tech review next week with that. Maybe I'll even do a video just for funsies. As for content updates, I don't have anything big. I have been playing a little bit of the new Tarkov wipe. We'll see if I stream any of that. I do want to finish the Mass Effect stream. The Mass Effect 3 playthrough, which we recently did the Rannoch arc, which means we're kind of in the latter half of the game, or really the final act is coming up basically. So we'll be doing that on stream. The podcast, I don't think I have enough material to do anything for the Mass Effect Hypecast anytime soon. Hopefully that changes. Obviously, I'll keep doing the Baunfire over the next few weeks. The last thing I did want to talk about, just because it was on my mind, and I'm thinking about trying maybe to do like a little charity stream or something. In the United States, if you're an international listener, and if you're not, then you've probably heard of this. In Texas, there was a big flash flood event where over 100 people have been found dead already, and that number is very likely to keep going up. And one of the locations that was hit the worst was in between a couple rivers that all had flash floods. If you don't live in an area where that happens, I do, and I've seen it happen before. You can have like basically a creek that's like 4 feet wide and a foot deep turn into a like 100-foot wide, like 40-foot deep river in a matter of minutes. What happened here was there was this girls' camp, or it was actually a boys and girls camp, but the girls' cabins and tents were closer to the water. The water raised in their camp 26 feet in 40 minutes. And there were hundreds of kids there. Luckily, the vast majority they evacuated and were able to get out. But unfortunately, I believe right now it's around 30 8 and 9-year-old girls and a couple of the camp counselors and the owner of the camp who was trying to save some kids, I guess, all got swept away and have either been found or are presumed dead. So, we talk about games, we do all this stuff. This whole issue here in the States is turning into a big political issue. There are definitely political implications that should be explored and talked about. That's not really my place, though. I just feel awful for those parents. I can't imagine sending your kid off for a few weeks to go have fun at a camp and then to never see them again. So have just those people in your thoughts. And I think it's smart to explore the mistakes in the political side of all this, but just remember the people. It sucks. And that is where we're going to wrap this one up. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app, leave a review on Spotify or iTunes, and subscribe to the Bond Diesel YouTube channel to get all my videos, including this podcast. Thank you to everyone who supports as a YouTube member or a Twitch subscriber. If you're interested in supporting this podcast and all of my other content, please check out the links in the show description. If you have any questions or feedback, please check me out on social media and reach me there at Baunfire or at the Baunfire. Hit me up on my Discord or leave a comment on Spotify or YouTube. That is all I have for this episode of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. So until next time. Thank you.